David Lane hated flying, but tonight he was on Flight 709 bound for Chicago. His mother was in the ICU after suffering a severe stroke. He couldn't risk being late. The boarding process felt endless. The gate agent scanned David's ticket and offered a strained, almost pitying smile. Something about her expression gnawed at him, but he chalked it up to exhaustion. He checked his seat assignment. 13C, an aisle seat. Fine by him, he hated being boxed in. As he walked down the narrow plane aisle, he noticed how eerily quiet the cabin was despite being nearly full. Passengers sat unusually still, faces expressionless, as though frozen in place. He blamed his nerves. He reached row 13. His seat was empty, but 13B wasn't. A pale, dark-haired woman stared vacantly out the window, her face partially obscured by her long hair. Her fingers tapped a slow, rhythmic pattern on the armrest, like counting something or keeping time. David cleared his throat. "Excuse me." The woman didn't react. Her vacant gaze remained fixed outside. He hesitated, then squeezed into his seat. The flight attendants went through the safety briefing, though their hollow voices sounded almost robotic. As the plane took off, David felt wrong. Not just nervous, something deeper, darker. A primal sense of being watched. 30 minutes into the flight, the cabin lights dimmed. David tried distracting himself with a book, but his eyes kept drifting toward the woman in 13B. Her breath came in shallow, strained gasps as though she were choking back terror. Then she spoke. "They'll come for you, if you're not careful." David jerked in his seat. "Sorry, what?" She turned toward him, her face pale and hollow-eyed. "They're always watching. They see what you've done." A chill ran down David's spine. "I think you might have me confused with someone else," she whispered, almost gently. "Do I?" Suddenly the flight jolted, turbulence rocking the plane violently. Luggage compartments rattled open, bags spilling into the aisle. The woman remained eerily still, untouched by the chaos. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, sounding strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered unexpected weather. Please remain seated." David clenched his fists, sweat beading on his brow. The woman turned back toward the window, resuming her tapping, counting. 1, 2, 3. David tried rationalizing what had happened. Perhaps she was mentally ill, a lost soul trapped in her own mind, but her words felt directed at him, like a blade slipping beneath his skin. He closed his eyes, trying to calm down. But when he reopened them, he wasn't in 13C anymore. He was standing in the back of the plane, staring at row 13 from the aisle. His heart pounded. How had he gotten there? He stumbled back toward his seat. But he was still sitting there. His body, his exact body, was buckled in, eyes wide open but lifeless. His doppelganger stared straight ahead, as though waiting for something or someone. David gasped, stumbling backward, crashing into a flight attendant. She didn't react, her eyes glazed and vacant. "Help!" he shouted. "Something's wrong," but no one moved. No one even acknowledged his existence. The passengers remained rigid, locked in place like mannequins. Then, from behind him, a soft, familiar voice. "They're always watching, and they've already chosen." Panicked, David ran toward the cockpit, but the door wouldn't budge. His pounding fists echoed in the empty cabin. The plane trembled again, the engines emitting a deep, groaning wail that sounded almost alive. He turned and saw her, the woman from 13B, standing in the aisle. Her eyes were no longer hollow, but glowing faintly with something dark and predatory. "Who? Who are you?" he demanded. She smiled faintly, her voice cold and measured. "You really don't remember, do you?" David stumbled back, memories flooding his mind in jagged, nightmarish fragments. A cold November night, a woman pleading for help on a deserted highway, him walking away. He staggered, breathless. "No, I didn't. I didn't mean to. I was scared. You left me there." Her voice turned icy, inhuman. "You left me to die." He fell to his knees, trembling. "It was an accident. I was drunk. I didn't know what to do." The plane groaned again, the lights dimming to almost total darkness. Outside the window, shadowy figures emerged from the storm clouds, crawling and writhing across the wings like living shadows. "They're coming for you," she whispered. "You're marked." Desperate, David charged toward the emergency exit. Maybe he could force it open, anything to escape this living nightmare. He yanked the lever, but it didn't budge. "They won't let you leave." David spun around. She stood inches away now, her breath cold against his cheek. her once human face twisted into something monstrous, dark veins, hollowed eyes burning with eternal hunger. "You traded your life for mine," she hissed. "Now, it's time to balance the scales." He backed against the wall, gasping. "Please, I didn't mean for any of it. I'm sorry." But there was no forgiveness here, no mercy, only judgment. Flight 709 landed at O'Hare Airport hours later, though its transponder signal had mysteriously vanished for most of the flight. Investigators boarded the plane, finding confused, disoriented passengers, but David Lane was gone. His seat, 13C, remained neatly buckled, as though he'd never been there. Security footage from the boarding gate was reviewed, but David's image never appeared. When asked about her experience, one flight attendant only managed to choke out a single trembling sentence. We don't have a row 13 on that plane." Story 2, The Black Box Whisper. Emma Caulfield had always loved flying, even when she was a child. Her dream had been to become a commercial pilot, and now at 31, she was living that dream. Tonight, she was the co-pilot on Flight 828, a cargo flight from Seattle to Anchorage, a routine assignment. Easy money. Her captain, Roger Mills, was a grizzled aviation veteran in his late 50s. Known for his no-nonsense demeanor, he rarely made small talk. But tonight, something about him seemed off, his usual confidence replaced by an almost haunted expression. "Everything okay, Captain?" Emma asked as they ran through pre-flight checks. He didn't look up. "Yeah, just tired." His tone was hollow. Emma frowned but didn't press. They'd been flying together for a few months, and Mills had always been steady as a rock. The tower cleared them for takeoff. As they climbed to cruising altitude, she noticed that Mills was gripping the controls harder than usual, his knuckles white. "Expecting turbulence?" she teased, trying to lighten the mood. His eyes flicked toward her, dark and unreadable. "You ever hear about the black box whisper?" Emma raised an eyebrow. "Is this one of your pilot ghost stories?" Mills sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's not a story, at least not to me." Curiosity tugged at her. "Okay, what's the black box whisper?" He hesitated, as though speaking about it might summon something dark. After a long pause, he answered, "They say, when a plane is doomed, when it's about to crash, the flight recorder, the black box, starts recording things that shouldn't be there." Emma smirked. "Like what? Weird static?" "No." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Voices. Passengers or crew from other crashes. People already dead. Pilots say they hear them over the radio, warning them or taunting them." Her smirk faded. The way he spoke wasn't like telling a spooky campfire tale. It was like someone remembering. Has it happened to you?" she asked. Mills didn't answer. He only muttered, almost to himself, "We should have turned back." Before she could question him further, the cockpit radio crackled with sharp static. The static rose into distorted whispers. Faint, distorted, almost human. Emma leaned forward, adjusting the comms. "Air traffic control, this is Flight 828. Please repeat, we're getting interference." There was no response. Suddenly, the static sharpened into words. A distorted, hollow voice whispered through the cockpit speakers. "Descending, engine failure, fire, impact imminent, brace, brace." Emma's breath caught. Is that coming from ATC?" Mills paled, eyes locked on the radio. "Turn it off." Emma hesitated. "It could be—" "Turn it off!" he barked, his voice trembling with something between fear and rage. She yanked off her headset. The whispers cut out instantly. The cockpit fell into uneasy silence, except for the drone of the engines. Emma's hands shook. "What the hell was that?" Mills clenched his jaw. "Just interference." But she could see the terror in his eyes. An hour passed without incident, though tension lingered like a storm cloud. Emma couldn't stop replaying the whispers in her mind. The way they'd spoken sounded real. Desperate, checking their flight path, she noticed something odd. They were several miles off course, heading directly into an unmarked storm cell. "Captain, we need to adjust our heading," she said, her voice steady despite her growing unease. Mills paled, eyes locked on the radio. "Turn it off." Emma hesitated. "It could be—" "Turn it off!" he barked, his voice trembling with something between fear and rage. She yanked off her headset. The whispers cut out instantly. The cockpit fell into uneasy silence, except for the drone of the engines. Emma's hands shook. "What the hell was that?" Mills clenched his jaw. "Just interference." But she could see the terror in his eyes. An hour passed without incident, though tension lingered like a storm cloud. Emma couldn't stop replaying the whispers in her mind. The way they'd spoken sounded real. Desperate, checking their flight path, she noticed something odd. They were several miles off course, heading directly into an unmarked storm cell. "Captain, we need to adjust our heading," she said, her voice steady despite her growing unease. Mills stared at the radar, breathing heavily. "We can't." Emma blinked. "What do you mean, we can't?" Before he could respond, the radio crackled again. Screams, faint and distant, cut through the static. Then the whisper returned. "There's no escape." Emma grabbed the controls, trying to override autopilot, but the system locked her out. "What's going on? Did you change the flight plan?" Mills stared at her, sweat dripping down his face. "They've already taken control." Desperate for answers, Emma frantically accessed the plane's onboard logs. But the data was corrupted, replaced by distorted audio clips, faint cries for help, pilot distress calls, and doomed final transmissions. She played one of the recordings. "Flight 828, emergency, engine failure. Repeat, we're going down." Emma's blood ran cold. "Flight 828, their exact flight number." The file abruptly ended with a sickening metallic groan, the sound of a plane being torn apart. The plane began losing altitude. Warnings blared from the dashboard. The right engine sputtered, threatening to cut out. Emma wrestled with the controls. "Captain, help me." But Mills was gone. His seat was empty, headset dangling from the control panel, still hissing static. Desperation took over. Emma transmitted an SOS signal. "Mayday, mayday, this is Flight 828. We've lost the captain. We're going down." Before she could finish, the radio screamed back, "You were never alone." Emma spun around. Mills was standing behind her. His eyes were black, his face twisted, frozen in terror. "They took me first. Now it's your turn." Flight 828 vanished from radar at 3:17 a.m. No emergency beacon was ever activated. No wreckage was found. No survivors. Story 3. The Empty Flight. Ravi Mehta had worked as a flight attendant for nearly 10 years. He had seen it all: drunken passengers, medical emergencies, even a wedding proposal mid-flight. Tonight's red-eye flight from New York to London was supposed to be routine. Just 198 passengers, mostly business travelers and restless tourists. But there was something off about Flight 507 from the moment they boarded. The passengers were unusually quiet, their faces blank, almost hollow. He tried passing it off as fatigue. It was, after all, a red-eye. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Good evening, folks. We'll be cruising at 35,000 feet. Estimated arrival in London is 7:45 a.m. local time." Ravi ran through the safety demonstration, though no one seemed to be paying attention. As he walked down the aisle performing seatbelt checks, he noticed 22F, a window seat near the rear of the plane, was occupied, but according to the manifest, it wasn't supposed to be. A man in an old-fashioned black suit sat stiffly, staring out the window. His pale, weathered hands rested on a small leather suitcase that looked wrong, like something out of another era. Ravi frowned and approached. "Excuse me, sir. May I see your boarding pass?" The man didn't move. His gaze remained fixed on the dark sky outside, breath fogging the window. Ravi repeated himself, louder this time. "Sir, your boarding pass." The man slowly turned his head. His sunken eyes met Ravi's, empty of warmth or humanity. He smiled, a twisted, knowing smile. "They're coming," he whispered. "You can't outrun them." Ravi stumbled back, heart pounding. "Sir," he stammered, but the man in 22F vanished. He blinked, frantically scanning the surrounding seats. Passengers sat motionless, oblivious. His pulse thundered in his ears. Desperate for some explanation, Ravi hurried to the nearest intercom panel. He keyed the captain. "Captain Reynolds, this is Ravi in the main cabin. We've got a situation." "What kind of situation?" the captain asked, his voice crackling with static. "There was someone in seat 22F, Ravi said, still breathless. "But he's gone. The manifest says the seat should be empty." Silence followed. Then the captain spoke, voice strained and distant. "Ravi, there is no seat 22F on this plane." Ravi bolted toward the rear of the plane, counting the seats one by one. 22F was still there. Empty now, but definitely real. Cold sweat drenched his back. He paced up and down the aisle, passengers still locked in unnatural stillness, faces blank, eyes unfocused. No one moved. His headset crackled. The captain again. "Ravi, report to the cockpit. Now." He sprinted forward, breathing heavily as he reached the flight deck. The cockpit door hung open. "Captain Reynolds?" Ravi called, stepping inside. The cockpit was empty. The controls blinked with meaningless readouts. The plane was flying itself. Frantic, Ravi checked the radio. "Mayday, this is Flight 507 requesting immediate assistance. We've lost the captain and co-pilot." The radio hissed, then a deep, distorted laugh filled the cabin speakers. "You're already dead, Ravi." Terror surged through him. Ravi checked the plane's emergency systems, trying to re-establish contact with ground control. Nothing worked. The plane cruised steadily, silent, mechanical, wrong. His mind reeled. Was he hallucinating? Was this some horrific nightmare? Desperate, he accessed the flight logs, hoping for something, anything, to explain this madness. He gasped as he scrolled through old, corrupted entries. The date on the logs showed December 14th, 1974. "What the hell?" he whispered, scrolling further. The system beeped, opening an archived news broadcast. Flight 507 was reported missing 50 years ago. Presumed crashed in the Atlantic, no survivors. Ravi staggered backward, mind spiraling in disbelief. Presumed crashed. Suddenly, plane shuddered violently. Outside the windows, dark, twisted figures clung to the wings, crawling toward the cabin. Their faces were grotesque, distorted, and familiar. They were passengers. Ravi staggered back toward the main cabin, but the passengers were gone. The seats sat empty now, eerily pristine, as though no one had ever been there. Only 22F remained occupied. The man in the black suit was back, his twisted grin wider than before. "You ran and ran, but you never left." Ravi's voice trembled. "Who? What are you?" The man chuckled darkly. "You don't remember, do you?" Before Ravi could answer, the plane pitched sharply downward. Alarms blared, lights flickered, casting shadows that seemed alive. The intercom hissed. "You were the one who doomed us, Ravi, when you abandoned the plane, when you left us behind." Memories surged back like a tidal wave. Ravi, a junior flight attendant on the original Flight 507, bailing out of the plane when disaster struck. He had survived, they hadn't. The plane spiraled faster, wind howling outside. Ravi dropped to his knees, sobbing. "I was young. I was scared. I didn't mean to. You left us to die." The door to the cargo hold swung open behind him, revealing a black abyss, crackling with energy, hungry. The man in the black suit stood calmly, motioning toward the open void. "It's time." Terrified but resigned, Ravi stumbled toward the edge. The wind screamed around him. "I'm sorry," he whispered as he stepped into the darkness. Years later, aviation historians debated the mystery of Flight 507. It had vanished from radar in 1974. Then again in 2024, when an exact duplicate of the original flight briefly reappeared before disappearing once more. The only surviving clue was an unregistered black box recording found floating in the ocean, a single, distorted message trapped in its corrupted audio file. "This is Flight 507, Mayday, descending, no survivors. They've come back." But 6 months later, a cargo plane on the same route picked up a strange distress signal. It was Emma's voice, distorted but unmistakable, trapped in a repeating broadcast. "Mayday, this is Flight 828. Emergency, engine failures, brace."